Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video, we're not only going to get our scenes all organized and set up even more nicely than they currently are, but we're going to do something cool, which is to allow very quick and easy setup of a brand new scene. So I've made a new scene. I've got tagged a bunch of items with scene setup. We'll be able to drop them in, click play, and that is how easy it will be to get a new basic scene off the ground with everything set up properly. So I will see you in there. Hasn't Rick done a wonderful job getting this level laid out? It's going to be shaping up into a proper game before we know where we are. I love all these notes and it's just a great approach. So thank you, Rick. All right, so first thing, when I play the game, I am immediately noticing that I'm not getting any cursor affordances coming up. And let me just see if it's the same deal in my combat sandbox. Yes, in neither case, my combat sandbox nor Rick's level are we getting cursor affordances. So why is that happening? Well, let's take a little look at how that should work. So we have a camera arm, and on it we have a main camera, and attached to that we have a cursor affordance script. Now, it's missing the textures for some reason. This has happened a couple of times in the project. Let's look at the textures, the target, the unknown, and the walk textures. The deal with them is that they must be set to cursor type, and I think what's been going on in my project is that I have in my version control system been ignoring changes to something called psd.meta files. Here you go, in my getignore. I'm ignoring when the PSD meta file changes. I'm going to stop ignoring that, which means that my version control system will stop throwing away PSD.meta files. Now, what are PSD.meta files? Well, these actual assets are Photoshop files, and PSD.meta files are the files that all of these settings in the inspector get saved to, things like the texture type, etc. So by ignoring the PSD meta files, I've been throwing away these settings, like setting this to cursor, which is not what I want to do. The same thing would have been going for the health bar as well. Those settings would have got thrown away. So what I'm going to do is just fix those up, hopefully for the last time. Put the target cursor on there, the unknown cursor in there, the walk cursor in there, and then just go ahead and apply that back to the prefab. Same goes for the game canvas, where it is asking for the health bars asset, which is there, and the health bar mask asset, which is there. Apply that back to the prefab. And I'm just going to check in my version control that we actually have seen a change to these meta files. Here you go, the psd.meta files. Don't need to worry how they're comprised. We're not supposed to change those, but we know now they're being saved. So I don't think this problem will come up again. That's great. So that's that bit done. Let me just check that it works over in Rick's level. And of course, I don't think Rick has a game canvas yet in his village, so we can sort that out while we're here. So save my scene, pop a game canvas into Rick's village, like so. At the top there would make sense. And let's just test in Rick's village. Hey, that's better. Awesome. Probably should just drop an enemy in real quick and make sure that that also works. It's right by the P. Where's the P? I don't know his level very well. Have to have a little wonder. Oh, there he is. There's the enemy. And yes, the cursor's changing. Great. I'll delete the enemy before Rick gets upset about me messing up his carefully crafted scene. And that is good. All right, that's the first bit of the video done. So do store your psd.meta files. So now, scene, folder, structure, and naming. Doesn't sound much fun, but it's going to tidy things up no end. And allow us to make sure that we can create new scenes with all the things we need in them, because we're starting to get a lot of things that we need in a scene. So firstly, let's talk about how they're arranged. Starting at the top, notice this new terrain file that Rick has created here. By making the terrain for this scene, the system has created this new terrain file thing. If I was to put a new one in the world, we'd get another terrain with just the layout, just the height map of the terrain. And if you look inside the new terrain asset, you have this splat map, which tells the system where to apply each different texture type, all right? So that's what that terrain asset is in your assets. So to find out which scene it's kind of obvious it's this scene in this case, but you can say find references in scene, and it will show you that everything else has gone gray and that the terrain is now the only thing that's in color and the only thing that's selected if you look on the left in the hierarchy, which tells you that this is indeed the scene that this terrain has been used in. So I'm going to put it right inside Rick's Village folder. And I'm actually going to name it the same as the folder. That's really important. Well, it's not really important, but it means that when we look at terrain files, perhaps through this filtering here, we don't actually have a filter for terrains, but if you were to look at all the terrain files in isolation, you'll know which level they apply to. All right, so that's Rick's Village terrain. Now let's talk about scene layout in another way. I'm going to show you something over on my combat sandbox for a moment. which is that we have a ground plane in here. Why did I use a cube? Just for simplicity. The order in which you introduce ground complexity, in my opinion, is you start off just with a cube because that's all you need. And then you go, actually, well, a cube's no good, so I'm actually going to get rid of it. We want something a bit better, which is a terrain, so I'll go ahead and do that. And then later, we end up possibly needing to change this terrain for a static mesh created in an external editing package. For instance, you could export the height map of the terrain into something like Blender. You could then use that as a starting point for your terrain and then go and sculpt it into one continuous mesh that allows for overhangs and things. One of the problems with Unity's terrain system, one of the limitations rather, is that it does not allow you to have any overhangs because it is a pure height map. Each position is just a particular height. So if my world's going to have a terrain in it, I want to standardize the way that we add terrains. We've been talking in our standards doc about how terrains work. And what I want to do is firstly give it some texture. So any new scene that we set up is going to want some sort of texture on the terrain. Grass, lush texture. Then I'm going to position it at -250, -100, as Rick has discussed with you, -250. Why that? Well, if we look from above, it just means that the origin is in the middle of the terrain, which is a reasonable standard for us for the moment. Okay, so that's what I'm doing there. Then I just play the game, I guess, for a second, have a quick look. Now, everything falls because the terrain is at -100 now, which is the deepest sea trench that we can have in our game. Of course, as Rick has discussed, we need to flatten this up to +100 so that now the ground is at sea level and we're at liberty to lower the terrain by up to 100 meters or raise the terrain by up to 500 meters. How do I know those figures? Well, down to -100 is obvious because the terrain is actually sitting at -100. You can't lower it any more than that. Why up up by 500? Well, because the total terrain height is 600. So it's 100 down and 500 up in our case. All right, the only other thing about this terrain is I think it looks a bit funny. The tiling of that texture is not brilliant. So if I just edit the texture, I can set the tiling to, I don't know, let's try 2 by 2. See how that looks when we actually zoom in. Looks a bit better. Okay, awesome. I also need to make the terrain a walkable layer. And now I have the terrain in the world in a way that is better, in that it is standardized. Now, this is a good time to prefab that terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and drag the terrain into the assets like that. I'm going to call it default terrain. And then this is a standard default terrain. It's very easy in a future level when you set one up just to drop the default terrain in. And there you go. You have a walkable terrain of the right setup. Yes, this is a way of embodying our standards in quite a nice way. Awesome. So that's that. That's a little bit about scenes. Oh, hold on. Let me just finish on that. A couple of other things here. If I now, in my level, have a terrain, one thing we're going to want to do quite soon so these enemies can rush us, so they can walk towards us, is to add something called a nav mesh. So from the window menu, you can get to navigation. And Rick will do this with you in his scene. Window navigation down here. And if I choose navigation static, create off mesh links and walkable like this and bake, then what you'll see, there you go, wait a second, is it all goes blue. And this is saying this is the navigation mesh. It's incredibly simple in my world right now. Now, the significance of that navigation mesh is we're not going to go into right now because it's not particularly relevant to what we're doing right here. We're talking about scene setup. But what it has done is it's created us a combat sandbox subfolder. I can verify that in source control. If we look down here, you see scenes, combat sandbox, and it's put a nav mesh asset inside that folder. So if Unity's going to do this anyway, let's not fight it. Let's have a corresponding folder for every scene with exactly the same name. Please cut and paste it if a nav mesh hasn't already created it. So Rick's Village has already got a bunch of stuff in it, and we've called it like that because Unity's going to do that anyway. Now what I want to do is just move anything that's specific to Rick's Village, like his Rick level sketch, into his folder, anything that are world objects like this block over to world objects, and then any shared materials between scenes into materials. The idea is if something's only used in Rick's Village, it stays in his folder. The moment it becomes shared, you bring it up a level. Nice and simple. We've also got default terrain sitting here because all new scenes are going to need a default terrain. All right, I think that's all I need to do in terms of organization, apart from we have another terrain. Now, where does this terrain exist? It doesn't exist. Well, it does exist in this scene, actually. So, yep, okay, I see what's going on. Again, you need to be careful when you create these terrains. This is the terrain data for my scene. So I'm going to move it into the Combat Sandbox subfolder, and then I'm going to call it Combat Sandbox. All right, and then this means that we need to be a little bit careful when we create new terrains, that they are ending up in the right folder. All right, otherwise it's all good and tidy. Next thing, creating a best practices discussion. So all of this stuff is basically talking about best practices. So I've got in the resources for you a link to this fantastic blog post, which I first read in 2012 and has now been updated by Herman here. And we've taken that blog post and copied it and pasted it into a Google Doc that we have also given you access to. You've given you read access. And the benefit of the Google Doc is, well, firstly, it formats really nicely. We can also change the doc to make it our standards, and we can comment like this as a team on it, and you can see us talking about it. Now, one of the things it says in here, and I suggest you skim read this whole doc, but pay reasonable attention to everything apart from the advanced coding stuff. One of the things it says is use prefabs for everything, and I tend to agree with that. Everything except for things like this environment and enemies placeholders. We don't want prefabs for those, but everything else should be a prefab, including this directional light. So I'm going to move this directional light. Doesn't matter where it lives in the scene with the directional light, just out the way is a good idea. But you know, that will soon be specialized to a sun. That's what we're using it like, and we might well add a script to give day-night cycles. So why don't we call it a sun? Prefab it as well. I think it's fair to say it's a world object. And then again, immediately that we're changing these new standards, let's go over to Rick's scene and say he doesn't need a directional light. What he needs is a sun. Now, if I change the sun prefab, it'll apply to all the levels. Now, you need to be a little bit careful of that because we may have set up a level for you know, a particular time of day. As long as you're just aware that this is a prefab, everything's a prefab, and you don't specialize it back to the prefab. You know, i.e., if we change this particular sun here by maybe rotating it until it's like late in the day, that won't be the case in my level, of course, until we click apply. That's pretty obvious. It's normal prefabby stuff. Now, the only thing I'm not going to make a prefab in this level that I have in mind is this terrain, because Rick has made a load of effort on the terrain, and I don't really want to affect that. And until we come to start adding any behavior or anything strange to the terrain, it doesn't really matter that Rick's terrain is not a prefab. But practically everything else is a prefab apart from placeholders, which is good news. Canvas, player arm, player, sun, those four are prefabs in Rick's scene. And then in my scene, we have very similar stuff with the addition, in this case, of the... Oh, what's different? Camera arm player. Let's just look back at Rick's. Spot the difference. Canvas, camera arm player, sun. Default terrain. It's just the terrain as I discussed. Otherwise, they're the same. Okay, cool. So, best practices. One of the ways to embed these best practices, and we've just talked about the fact that everything should be a prefab, is to think about how do we set up a brand new scene, right? If we set up a new scene, what needs to be in it? Well, it's not that obvious, and one way to make it obvious is to create ourselves a nice tag. So we go through and say, well, we're going to need a camera arm. So you tag it down the bottom right here of the inspector. If you don't get this thing, then drag it up. Tag it with the word, say, scene setup. All right, then you come along and say, well, we need a game canvas. Great, add the scene setup tag. Well, we're going to need a player. Great, add the scene setup tag. And so on. We're going to need a default terrain. Okay, well, that's fine. Let's tag that with scene setup. We're going to need a sun. Okay, tag that with scene setup. All right, there you go. So, and then when you do that, you can use this little tagging feature here. By the way, I'm about to challenge you to do all this, so you don't need to follow this bit along. You go to scene setup at the top right of the project tab. You get everything that you've currently agreed needs to be in a scene. You drop it in, and with any luck, if you've got it set up right, and this is basically the result of your challenge, you have a guy who can move around with UI on a terrain that works and that's at the right height. How easy is that to set up a new scene? That is what we're after. That's what we're aiming for. So, given that that's what we're aiming for, I just want to challenge you to do that. Create scenes then. Create your own scene setup tag, test it in a new scene, and repeat as often as you like until you can do what I just did, which is drop in everything that's tagged as scene setup into a brand new scene and have the game actually work. Make sure you've got things like the walkable layer on the terrain's all set up right, etc. To test that it works, the player can walk on this newly flattened terrain, and also your cursor highlight should work for walking, enemies, and question mark. So go ahead, pause the video, and have a go at that now. Cool, welcome back. So I'm basically done with that. I need to do two more things to test this. One thing I need to do is to see what the cursor is going to do if I go to somewhere that is unknown. So I could always just drag my terrain over for a second, pop an enemy in just temporarily. I'll undo these changes in a second. Play the game, check that firstly the cursor works over the enemy and secondly that it works over unknown. It's not changing over unknown, and that's probably because we've got a bit of a bug in the raycasting code. So let me just fix that. Although I do forewarn you, we are going to completely rip out the raycasting code before too long. But let me just see if I can find out why we are not showing on the question mark in the code real quick. And also, maybe worth you seeing why. It's probably actually in, the raycasting code. And it's here. What's happening is when we return the background hit, we are never broadcasting that. So what we want to do in that case is just say that it's the layer hit, which is in this we've just set as the raycast end stop. We just need to broadcast that out so that the cursor affordances picks it up. Let's just test that. And then I'll show you the code if you missed that. I know it was rather quick. Yep, the question mark's working. So the fix for that bug is just to add this line in 55 in my code to the camera raycaster. We will be swapping out the camera raycaster altogether shortly, actually, to a slightly better architecture one. But that's the fix. Okay, cool. So I can use undo safely here because the only changes I made that matter and I want to persist are in code. So Control-Z is perfectly safe here. The code will maintain. I don't actually need this new scene that I've set up. So I'm going to, with volition, come out of the scene, not saving it. And I'm back to my combat sandbox, all working fine. And if I was to get to the edge of the world, I believe that the question mark would work. Now, one other way to test this question mark, of course, is you could just grab you could stop moving. Wait, stop moving. You could grab the camera, you could rotate the camera in X, and then you could just hover over something in the distance there. What's actually happening here is it's not getting off the terrain, but it's getting beyond that maximum raycasting distance. So that tests that as well. Okay, cool. So that is it, I think, for this video. Thank you very much for your attention. We are in a nice, clean state where we are able to, just using this tag, go ahead and set up new scenes very quickly, and everything is looking good. So I'll see you in the next video.